So you have to be on the Green Berets team to go do collections. If there's an unaccounted for loss, they come see you. They build the network of individuals that are purchasing the straw buys for the firearms to take them into Mexico. Like, people don't understand just how crucial the American military has been in the form of their, former soldiers, airmen. A lot of military personnel have been critical in the development of the Sinaloa Cartel.
The opinions of the guests and host are their own and do not represent the opinions of IRONCLAD, the Border Patrol, or the Department of Homeland Security.
Welcome to Borderland, Narcosis, an IRONCLAD original. Our next guest went completely viral when he mentioned a few things about special operations operators in the cartel. Pierre's back, and we have some more questions for him, and I know you're going to like it, so check it out. So let me ask, did you receive a lot of feedback from our last podcast?
There was yes, quite a bit of feedback, actually. Numerous people have reached out. Quite frankly, I was shocked at how unwilling people are to consider information with which they would have no basis to refute. Like, I know the individuals.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing what I've noticed. So I allow experts to come onto the podcast, use the platform, and state their claim, whatever it may be. And everyone that we bring on the show, we vet the story enough that as much as we can. And everyone we've had are professionals in their space, right? Even gentlemen like the Flores twins. When we had Jay on, people questioned his validity, which if you and I know the background of him, but still it didn't matter. I think there's a discrepancy between what the American people think of with the cartel space, drugs, and trafficking compared to the Mexican side of our world. And some of them are very connected into the storylines. It's a different story, I think, being told. And so you'll have this discrepancy on whether people believe certain individuals are valid or not, or legitimate or not. And I find that fascinating. It's something that I myself was like, wow, it's a weird thing that I'm noticing throughout the comments and everything else.
I'm very familiar with Jay, and he and I knew some of the same people in Los Angeles and down south. And unequivocally, Jay was the largest American trafficker ever prosecuted in the history of the United States, bar none. And so for people to call into question his bona fides is just, come on, man. Like, he dealt directly with Chapo Guzman, dealt directly with Miles Zambada, and dealt directly with Arturo Beltran. Those are three of the four largest drug lords within the Sinaloa structure, which at the time consisted of 60 organizations. Now, in the United States, they only had 7 or 8 of those organizations present in the U.S. And this is the point that I was illustrating earlier in our last discussion. Jay Flores is an American of Mexican descent. He comes from a respected pedigree in that his father was a respected trafficker. He was able to deal directly with them on that pedigree. However, when he began dealing with them directly, he didn't work for none of those people. He was the first tier wholesale level customer. He purchased the product after he moved to Mexico. All of the transactions in Jay's case happened in Mexico. They didn't happen in the United States. They placed the orders in Guadalajara. They need 900 kilos. He took delivery in Chicago. The deals were all done in Mexico. Now, the guy in Mexico was a gentleman named Germán Olivares. He was Miles' primary lieutenant. So Jay would go to G and say, hey, 900 kilos to Chicago. G calls the E9 in Los Angeles at the distribution hub. Send 900 units to Chicago for Jota. The guy, the E9 in LA, from the distribution cell, he calls the E9 from the transportation cell. 2 different organizations. Zambada's organization handled the distribution operation. Nacho Coronel's organization handled the trucking operation. Now, I know the names of the individuals in Los Angeles. I'm just not putting their business out there. Germán Olivares has been charged in a half a dozen different indictments. He's one of the most powerful guys within the Sinaloa structure. And Jay's already publicly disclosed him. So I'm citing his disclosure. And so when G calls LA, he talks to the E9 in LA. The E9 from the distribution cell calls the E9 with the transportation cell. The E9 from the transportation cell loads up 3 tractor trailers with 300 keys in each one, and they send them to Chicago. The E9 from the distribution cell in LA calls the E9 in Chicago and says, you got 3 trucks on the way. Once it gets to Chicago, the E9, the cell in Chicago receives the truck. So they send the truck on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. On Thursday, Friday, Saturday, the trucks arrive. So on Thursday, they unload the first 300. On Friday, the second 300. On Saturday, the third 300. The E5 within the Chicago cell will take 300 in a van and drop it off to Jay Flores' representative in Chicago. Once the product gets to Jay Flores' representative in Chicago, cartel's over with. They're done. The largest operation in the United States involved no financial transactions in the US. It was simply logistics. They bought the product in Mexico. It originated out of LA to Chicago. There wasn't 12 men involved in this entire operation. And the only people talking to each other are the E9s. Everybody else, you got E7s that are operating. You got a few E6s and a couple of E5s. They're the little runners. So where's this enormous footprint that I'm seeing? I keep hearing about. Where's this talk about he's not talking about the gangs and the retail distribution. There is no retail distribution. Jay Flores is buying tens of millions of dollars worth of product a month. That's who they deal with. Not some broke dick joker doing $50 deals here, $20 deal there. Are you people insane? Like on the one hand, I hear people saying how sophisticated the cartels are. They're generating tens of billions of dollars in profits. But on the other hand, you think they're going to use gang members? It's absurd. Yeah. The operation handle at the J level operation. And what's interesting is once the product gets to Chicago and Jay Flores' representative gets possession of the product, the cartel's operations are over with. From that point forward, all of it is American-based trafficking. Jay Flores had his customers in Chicago. None of them are cartel. The guys in Minneapolis, Detroit, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Memphis, Louisville, Columbus, St. Louis. None of them are cartel. They're all Flores customers. So Flores is a cartel customer. Everybody else in all those other cities are all customers of a customer. Where's the cartel presence?
Yeah.
It ends with the delivery.
I guess that's the confusion, is that a lot of people are really having trouble defining where that cutoff starts and ends. And we as Americans have just said cartel for everyone. We've blanket statement that, and which has the American people very confused on who is and who isn't. And then it turns into there's a form of fear mongering that happens with that as well. There's a lot of little things that happen that create this kind of space of confusion of how do you label a gang to a cartel to just a drug runner who just decided to continue to keep pumping drugs down someone, in some city.
There are no gangs linked to cartels. They don't deal with gang members. You have to come with at least 7 figures to the table. Gang guys are the kind of guys that they're so far removed, they're selling dime bags of weed. These are the guys that when they're broke, they're knocking off a 7-Eleven or a liquor store. People that are doing hundreds of millions of dollars worth of product a month aren't talking to these guys. They're nowhere near these people. Stash houses are in Arcadia. The distributors live in San Dimas. They live in Arcadia. They live in Santa Monica. We had the labs in Beverly Hills. The meth operation for Valencia's organization, which handled methamphetamine, his stash houses were in Newport Beach. Now, you're familiar with Los Angeles. Those are some of the richest, wealthiest cities in the country. Newport Beach, Arcadia, San Marino, Beverly Hills. That's where you find the big money players. There is no tie. Look, you see, the problem here is we're at the point in this country where if the guy happens to be Latino, they're calling him cartel. They're lumping Guatemalans in. They're lumping in American Chicanos in. The Mexicans don't lump these people in at all. They don't even consider American Chicanos to be Mexican.
So let me ask a question just on this. I want to get to other things, but if someone is from Guatemala, Colombia, name it, outside of Mexico, are they not allowed to be considered cartel in the cartel's eyes? Are they not cartel? They're just, anything else other than that?
Well, again, remember, there's 2 spheres. In the United States, they're customers of a customer. They're not dealing with Guatemalans. Now, in Mexico, they'll deal with anybody. Because, see, in Mexico, the American government does not send undercover agents into Mexico to do deals. They lure the Mexican trafficker either into the United States or into a third-party nation, whether it's Panama or Uruguay, where it's safe. Because in Mexico, well, and again, just to clarify for your audience, we're talking about Sinaloa.
Yes.
And to a lesser extent, Jalisco. Because we had a lot of people complaining, are you saying there's no cartels in Oklahoma? I'm saying Sinaloa is not in Oklahoma. You have 3 cartels south of Texas. They may very well be in Oklahoma, but that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about the Juarez Cartel. We're not talking about the Northeast Cartel, and we're not talking about the Gulf Cartel. Presumably, they're all traversing Oklahoma, but they got to get through Oklahoma to get to their markets. They're all out of Texas. So now, in the American sphere, they use citizenship to filter out law enforcement. In Mexico, they deal with anybody that comes into Mexico because you're putting your life in their hands. And the American government understands that there is a rule, at least within Sinaloa, do not harm American civilians, do not harm American law enforcement. There is no rule against harming American criminals. So if you're a trafficker and you go into Mexico looking to buy product, there's a very good chance that someone may say, you know what? I'll just keep the $3 million and put this guy in a ditch. And so American law enforcement doesn't go into Mexico to do deals. So if you're an American, and I knew plenty of guys that want to go into Mexico to get product. You can get in at the Tijuana price is a lot cheaper than the LA price. But now you're taking the risk of going into TJ. And quite frankly, there's a chance you don't come back. We had the largest lab set up in the country at the time. The DEA considered a super lab to be 10 pounds. We were producing 100 to 120. We're talking about ice at the time. Well, that was out of Beverly Hills. Well, when Armando Valencia, one of the main drug lords from Mexico, wanted to move the operation because they're the ones supplying the material in connection with the investigation the government called the Robles conspiracy. Well, they wanted to move the Robles conspiracy manufacturing from LA to Mexico because we could go 10 times the size of the super lab status in LA, but we couldn't do 1,000 pounds at a time. You need warehouses. They're saying move the operation to Mexico because they can protect it. They have police there, the police are all corrupt down there. Well, I didn't trust them with my life in Mexico. They needed the special skills because we had the chemists and the labs. So they'll deal with us in the United States because they needed us here. Down there, what's to stop them from just kidnapping you, forcing you to teach their people how to do the reactions, and then unaliving you and don't have to pay us? And so, yes, there are many Americans that go into Mexico to do transactions. And so that's a different category. So if you're Guatemalan, if you're Latino, if you're any group, if you want to go into Mexico, hey, no problem. I got to become really good friends with the guy in prison who was the son of the Honduran president. The Honduran president was taking payoffs to let 20-ton shipments coming through. And the son, of course, is the point of contact. The adult son was the point of contact with the Mexicans and with the Colombians. And so the Hondurans were taking their pay in product. So the Mexicans were like, yeah, sure, we have no problem transporting your product for you. It's a delivery service. But they're not supplying the product to Honduran customers in the United States. They'll deal with the Hondurans in Honduras or in Mexico because they know that's not DEA. And so always think in terms of minimizing your footprint, minimizing the risk. And so people have a misconception just because they're poorly educated that they're not savvy. They're very savvy. They're very clever. They're just not book smart.
Yeah. Man. So anything else that stood out from that first interview that you want to address?
Well, quite frankly, I spent, I got sentenced in 2000. I was released from prison last year. So I spent 24 years in prison and I essentially missed the entire social media thing. And I have an interesting perspective in that when I went away in the late 1990s, it was a very different world. I've come home and it's like I'm in a different country. People have lost the ability to reason. People are taking just on its face contradictory positions. People are taking positions that are just absurd. this whole I can't tell you how many guys I got. You're not talking about the gangs in the retail level. Like, are you insane? Like, or they use the gangs to go do collections. No, they don't. They have a separate team. That's a second Green Beret who handles the domestic affairs in the United States. His team does the collections. His team procures the firearms. So you have multiple teams headed up by American. Last time we were talking about the CJNG's paramilitary wing. The
let's talk about
team
that.
is also headed up by a separate Green Beret. They can move freely in the United States. They're not going to be sending up Mexican nationals. So you have to be on the Green Berets team to go do collections. If there's an unaccounted for loss, they come see you. They build the network of individuals that are purchasing the straw buys for the firearms to take them into Mexico. Like, people don't understand just how crucial the American military has been in the form of their, former soldiers, airmen. A lot of military personnel have been critical in the development of the Sinaloa Cartel.
Even Air Force? Are you sure about that?
Let me tell you a funny story about Air Force. Okay, the Sinaloa Cartel exists today because back in the 1990s they were on their last leg, the weakest of all the cartels. Well, one of the men from Sinaloa, who's credited with being the most famous trafficker in all of Mexico, is named Amado Carrillo. Hundreds of songs written about him, movies. One of the most popular telenovelas of all time is based on his character. And Amado Carrillo gets credited with creating the most sophisticated air wing in the history of criminal endeavors. Let's just put it that way. And what's interesting about Amado Carrillo is he wasn't a pilot and he wasn't a logistical expert. See, Amado Carrillo gets the credit for building that air wing. And this is the air wing where they took 727, 737 civilian airliners, gutted them, turned them into cargo planes. Well, that entire operation was actually ran by a retired U.S. Air Force officer. I know the man. I'm a writer. I've spoken with a number of these individuals. I actually spent 2 days talking with this gentleman. Today, he's an older man in the late 70s, pushing 80. He's retired, lives up in Seattle. Well, he built that air wing. It was his logistical expertise that kept Sinaloa alive throughout the decade of the 1990s, using that way to get the product in. They're getting 30 tons a month into Mexico with the civilian airliners. All of that was conceived and built by a United States Air Force officer. Without that gentleman's assistance, there'd be no Sinaloa Cartel today.
All right, I digress. Let's talk about, can you help us understand better? The thing that went viral was you talking about the CJNG, their paramilitary wing was ran by 4 special operations guys. Mm-hmm. And then in my notes that you mentioned that there's that second Green Beret. Can you clarify all that for us?
Well, everything is done on the basis of teams and they're compartmentalized. From my understanding was with respect to the CJNG. Remember, when this was originally built, CJNG was still part of Sinaloa. It broke away and they formed a separate group. And it's important that we don't use hindsight, because when the men get involved, they don't know that 10 years later, they're going to be the number one organization and they're going to be at the top of the list of getting targeted. Circumstances develop that are unanticipated, quite frankly. And so, yes, you've got the 4 guys that were known. Now, I've spoken with the Special Forces guy in the last week. He said that his contacts within the intelligence community have confirmed that they know the identity of the 4 men. Like, I didn't know their names. I just knew their existence. And he said there are a number of other Army Rangers in addition to those 4. Now, I have a friend who was a Ranger who they attempted to recruit. So I've got a pretty good understanding of the pitch they made. Well, from what I understand, you've got the American Special Forces, which are utilizing the same protocol that was used to train the Afghani Army's elite units. And so they take that training, that protocol, and use that to build up the CJNG. So you've got former Mexican Special Forces, which serve as the day-to-day commander actually interacting with the Mexican nationals. But the Special Forces from Mexico are coordinating with the American Special Forces, who do the operational planning, the tactical responses to military operations. and they basically get the guys tuned up. From what I was, they use the same method as in Afghanistan, and the Americans are only there to put in assistance if it's necessary. Like the CJNG's people get sent out. So the day-to-day operations are the Mexican Special Forces. You've got a body of individuals that are just former Mexican military, and then that's supplemented by individuals from Central America, a lot of Guatemalans and Hondurans, which are their special forces. And so the Americans they use what I was told is they call it coaching from the rear, which is the mindset they utilized in Afghanistan, where they send the Afghani units out to do the engagements and they only get involved in the event something goes sideways. And so that unit, they don't just go around attacking law enforcement, and they don't go around attacking even Mexican military. They defend themselves when they're attacked. Like the 4 guys, they're responsible for maintaining the security details for the higher ups. So they do a lot of the training, and they do the security detail for the, Mencho and the other bigwigs. And so when they engage, they do the tactical responses to military operations that are compromised because corrupt officers within the Mexican military call and tip them off. So they know when they're coming. So they always try to run away. They tried to run. When they blew up the helicopters out of the sky, they were trying to leave. The helicopters they fell into their formation. They started descending on their run. Well, in that circumstance, they had to defend themselves. But they weren't looking to blow the copters out of the sky any more than you had the same situation a few years ago when Chapo Guzman's son, Ovidio, got arrested. Well, that was a unanticipated arrest. Well, if you look how the Sinaloa operated, how'd they get him out? Well, within an hour, you had 700 men descend on the scene. And what was interesting is they already had the arrangement set up. While there was engagements on the street with the local law enforcement, they stormed the military base. They took all of the officers' families, put them in their homes, and then wired the homes with explosives. Then they called the general at the base and said, either you release him or we blow up all your families. So they'd already identified who all the officers are, where they lived, and had a prearranged plan. So that means these are tactics. They didn't develop this on the fly. This is pre-planned. In the event one of the big guys get arrested, this is what you're going to do. 1, 2, 3. Well, that's where the Americans get involved. They come up with the plans and they're executed by the military wings. They're soldiers, that's essentially. The big boys aren't. The colonels aren't in the middle of the gunfight. They're in the back.
Yeah. I've had some intel saying that there is Ukrainian military as well in Mexico teaching them drone warfare. Any have you ever heard anything about that?
No. The only group I know of are Israelis, and that's very limited. I mean, you heard a little bit about Israelis, but no, not Ukrainians. I haven't heard anything like that. There's a few years ago, there was a big leak. Essentially, it's like the Spanish language version of WikiLeaks. It's called the Guayacama leaks. And it showed, like a large number of terabytes of data from the Mexican Defense Department. And it literally has over 4 million emails where, generals are communicating with generals and colonels with colonels and openly discussing the fact weapons are getting sold to the cartels. They're comparing numbers on bribes, like how much are you getting? Well, the guy in Oaxaca's getting $500 a year. Well, the guy in Guadalajara's got to get a lot more than the guy in Oaxaca. So when he goes to renegotiate his new contract, he says, hey, the guy in Oaxaca's getting $500, I want $750. And so we've got a really good insight into the depth of corruption within the Mexican military, but there hasn't really been any discussion about foreign nationals in the sense of Ukrainians coming in. Now, granted, the information is from 2023, so it could be more recent, but no, I haven't heard anything either through discussions with cartel guys or through any of the open source material I've been able to review.
Yeah, I just think it's fascinating how fast they've become very knowledgeable using drones and how effective they've been recently through some of the videos that I've been able to see.
Well, the drones for smuggling purposes, that's common. That's common. One of the CJNG guys that I was, bullshitting with one day, he said they've got so many drones flying back and forth, just like the air pattern over LAX. I mean, it's just all night drones going. And so, but the economics of the narco world have changed with the introduction of the synthetic, the fentanyl. I don't want to say the word. Because for the first time, small amounts, 2 kilos, 3 kilos, represent hundreds of thousands of dollars. I was in the system for 23 years before I met my first backpacker. Before that, I always look at it from the economics perspective. How much can a backpacker bring? Let's say he's bringing in 5 kilos. You're going to pay him $1,000 a key? Well, why is somebody going to risk 10 years for $5,000? The 10-year mandatory minimum. And you can give the same product to the local cartel rep. They'll smuggle it for you for the same $1,000, and they insure your product. Who's going to turn down the insurance? So it wasn't an economically viable business model to have backpacking up until the introduction of the synthetics. Because now it takes $3,400 to produce the same amount of material, 2 or 3 keys. For 2 kilos, you're going to sell them for $300,000 in Phoenix. So there's an enormous profit margin at this point, which makes backpacking economically viable. So when people talk about building a wall, that's where it would be impactful, because the backpackers are actually working behind the backs of the cartels. The local mom and pop producers, they're not supposed to be doing this. They're supposed to be selling it to the cartel group. They're going behind their back. That's why they can't give it to them, because they'll pay a much cheaper price in Mexico. They'll pay 60 cents a dose, as opposed to the American that'll pay $3 to $6 a dose in Phoenix.
We've seen the numbers of smuggling. Well, I'll say this: we've seen the numbers of illegal immigration go significantly down. I'm curious to your experience. Do you believe that also has affected drug trade?
No.
Why is that?
Well, because you've got multiple redundant systems that are based on, you look at the highly publicized photographs, Mexican troops, 10,000 troops on the border. Yeah, well, none of them are anywhere near a tunnel. Just going right underneath it. They're not searching every tractor trailer coming through. You got 15,000 trucks coming through every day. You've got a truck with 12,000 pounds full of lettuce in the back. Are they going through every crate? That's all show. Of course, it does nothing for the large operations, the guys that could afford to spend $20, $25 million setting up an importation cell in Tijuana. The mom and pop guys have to do the backpacking. Those are potentially going to get subjected to interceptions because now you got a lot more boots on the ground. You build a wall, you knock those people out. But with respect to the large operations, no, it's much more sophisticated than a few soldiers on the border. That's not going to impact anything.
IRONCLAD creates premium content no matter the environment. From extreme elements to unforgiving terrain, we thrive on crafting content that captures the essence of your brand in the most challenging conditions. Bring your brand story to life, ensuring your message leaves an impact. Ready to elevate your vision? Connect with us today at ironcladagency.com.
Things like flight, boats, maritime, planes, those still happening at a massive scale?
I've only known a few guys that did the airplanes, only because look, there's so many more economically viable options. On a small single engine plane, what are you talking, 90 kilos? Now you got to recruit a pilot. You're going to have to get the aircraft. It's just much more, always think in terms of infrastructure. Like one of the guys that were involved on the periphery in my case, they would go up to Portland, take the little municipal airports. They just basically, those planes are unlocked. They just get on the plane, boom, take off. Then they fly down to Tucson. They're literally just stealing the plane, going to Tucson, putting in fuel bladders, bomb running down to Panama, picking up the load, flying back up to the U.S., coming into the country at, below the radar at treetop height, landing the plane outside of Phoenix, taking out the product, and then firebombing the plane. What are you doing all of that for 90 keys? Like, it's just way too much effort when you could just take possession of 90 units in LA for $14.5 apiece? And so the smuggling operations do not focus so much on airplanes into the United States, only because there are so many more economically much more viable options. Now, do they do it every once in a while? Sure, because they got to keep everybody on their toes. You know, they use the drones. Now with the Feni, it's actually viable. Before the Feni, they were just doing it to keep people preoccupied. You know, they use catapults.
Yeah.
And so, you know, they got catapults. They show them on the, I've seen videos on YouTube. Well, one of the guys I talked to said they got a whole fleet of catapults. They just go up and down, boom, 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 just launching bags. You know, the catapults aren't illegal. They just built them on an old boat trailer. And so whenever the Border Patrol sees a dually pulling a catapult, they got to dispatch men. They just got fleets of catapults going up and down, just keeping guys tied up. You know, they'll have the guys come in the little, like the Jacques Cousteau boats. They'll go right from TJ into San Diego. You know, our border goes right into the ocean, but it's only like 100 yards. There's the wall. Afterwards, it's just, you know, kids out there are surfing. So they'll send kids over just to tie up assets, to have the Border Patrol's got to run out there to see what the hell's going on. There's just a bunch of kids playing in the ocean. But every time you have an incursion, they have to be responded to. Those are distractions from the main operations.
What do you think about recently? They talked about in the news, the U.S. military is going to start training some Mexican forces again.
Look, our military is unquestionably the most competent in the world. And the issue that I have has always been on the Mexican side of the equation, only because in Mexico, you've got issues of just systemic corruption. Now, you're a younger man. In your lifetime, do you realize that 2 of the 5 Secretary of Defenses in Mexico in your lifetime were dirty? Those are 2 we know for a fact. We don't know about the other guys. They may or may not have been honest. Let's assume they were honest. That's a 40% likelihood that the guy today is corrupt. Would you bet your life on that?
No.
Well, you're betting the lives of our service members. Because there is not a single operation involving Mexican military assets in Mexico that the Secretary of Defense doesn't know about. So whichever group is paying for protection, operations that targeting that group are compromised. The intel that you receive about that group is going to be disinformation to distract you and deflect your attention to that group's opposition. So now we're subject to getting manipulated. And in the event they are targeting the protected group, our men are going into ambushes. So now if you're talking about sending Mexican military assets into ambushes, well, I'm American. I'm worried about our guys. But when you start talking about putting American service members, embedding them with the groups, now you got to start thinking carefully, like, hey, how can you trust an unreliable partner?
Yeah. And
I don't mean to imply that all of them are corrupt, but one of the lessons we've learned from the Genaro Luna case, and we're just talking, this is in 2019, Luna got knocked off. He was their FBI director. But one of the lessons we learned from his case is that he didn't turn corrupt at the age of 53 when he became FBI director. He'd already been getting paid for 25 years. The second lieutenants that were working at the airbase where the 737s were getting landed 30 years ago are today's generals. Well, they've been getting envelopes for 30 years. These are the people that are today populating the leadership of the defense structure in Mexico, the leadership of federal law enforcement. So there's no evidence indicating that Claudia Sheinbaum is corrupt. On the contrary, it looks like she probably isn't corrupt. But do we know that about her chief of staff? Do we know that about the people in her the various department heads? So you have to assume in a country where the FBI director was dirty, the DEA chief was dirty, the drug czar was dirty, the Secretary of Defense was dirty. Well, you can't take the assumption that it's reasonable to put our men at risk or partner with the Mexican military forces, knowing that you could be sending our guys into ambushes. So now if you want to keep the Mexican government out entirely, well, then that's fine. Of course, now we're violating their sovereignty. It's a whole bunch of political issues. But at least you're taking reasonable steps to protect our men.
Yeah. I think a lot about the Los Zetas and how, the GAFE, how we trained them. and then kind of turn around and kind of bit us in the butt. It almost feels like it's rewriting history again, and it sounds like it could potentially turn into the same exact thing.
Yeah, they target individuals with specialized skills, and there are, we train many people, Guatemala, Honduras, throughout Central America, who have a skill set that is very valuable, and they're willing to, these groups are generating anywhere from 19 to 29 billion dollars a year. So they can afford, I'm talking about all of the cartels in collection. Well, you've got 9 cartels. If there's $30 billion available, well, they're hiring the best people. And so, yes, you're correct in that you've got individuals with high level of military training who are highly incentivized through significant financial compensation.
Do you have a rough estimate or thought of how much you think cartels like the CJNG would offer law enforcement, former special operations guys? I'm kind of trying to understand what's that number that someone was willing to just give up everything and go do that.
Well, I don't know, and I don't like to speculate. I have no doubt it's in the 7 figures.
Yeah.
And again, remember when they started, they didn't anticipate it to being what it is today.
Yeah.
They train with guys down in Guatemala. The individual that handles the domestic operations here in the United States was a 7th group. So he did a lot of training down in Central America, and he developed relationships with people. Those guys go to work in Mexico. Now they extend an invitation to the Americans, say, hey, why don't you come down here and work with us? Well, guys oftentimes find themselves in the circumstances where it escalated beyond what they anticipated. And now when you're in, there's really no way to back out. Because if you come back to the United States, you're still looking at a significant amount of time.
This SF guy that you're talking about that you say currently runs the operations side in the United States, he's the one who does a collection of guns. He's the one who does or sets up that. He's the one who also does a collection of money. That's a fact. Like, for a fact, it's a 7th group special operation.
He lives in Mexico. He doesn't.
Understood.
He organizes the teams that handle everything in here. And so, yes, that's just, what he gets paid, I don't know. And only because they tried recruiting my friend to provide services here. Like, he didn't want to go to the paramilitary wing. They said, okay, well, can you get us hardware in the form of weaponry? He's like, look, my friend was just down there buying product. Once the guy in Guadalajara found out he's American former military, that's when they bring in our former service members to make their pitches. So he turned down the CJNG and offered to go for the paramilitary wing. So then here comes the guy that handles American operations. Would you be willing to do work in the States? Can you get us weapons? Can you help our people move around? Because he knows the States. And so he wasn't interested in either one of those 2 opportunities. And so, I never asked him what were they offering in the form of pay, because they were basically making unsolicited offers. Like, he's down there buying product, and you guys are cluttering up the operation with all this other stuff.
Yeah. In more recent news, what are your thoughts on the 29 cartel members that were handed over to U.S. custody by Claudia Sheinbaum?
Mr. Trump is playing 3-dimensional chess. And I think that with respect to this context, he is probably uniquely qualified to be able to achieve the objective, so long as the objective is to stop the production and importation of fentanyl. And, just last week, there was a big report in the Los Angeles Times where they spoke with Trump officials on background. In fact, I got the quote right here. It said that the Trump administration's policy, their hope is that the cartels will, quote, step back away from fentanyl, and they'll just go back to what they've always done, which is cocaine and methamphetamines and a little bit of heroin. If that's the goal, that's achievable. And that will end up saving 80 to 90,000 Americans' lives every year, because what that goal actually represents is a return to the status quo ante 2015. And so what you see Mr. Trump doing is he is altering the incentive landscape. He's not targeting the cartels. He's targeting the Mexican government. And he's doing it through a credible threat of using tariffs as leverage to align their incentives with ours. And one of the manifestations we've seen in that is the handing over of these 29 cartel men. Now, what's significant about this is Mr. Trump's policy has obviated what's called the protection market in Mexico. The protection market was created in 2007, and it is what allows for the cartels to operate. And so the judges that have been gumming up the extraditions for 10, 11, 15 years, what they're doing is because they were paid. Well, what Ms. Sheinbaum did in response to Mr. Trump's credible threats is she invoked the national security law and handed these men over. They weren't extradited in accordance with the treaty. They were expelled out of the country. That's why a man like Caro Quintero, he's facing capital charges. A Mexican national would never face capital charges if he was extradited according to the treaty. And so this is an entirely new element that I'm sure has shaken the cartel leadership to its core. Because their first and second and third line of defense is always corrupt Mexican political figures. Well, if Ms. Sheinbaum is prepared to forego the extradition process and just start handing over people, like two of the guys she handed over were guys that got arrested in the last 3 weeks. They hadn't even been to court. She's just kicking people out of the country. That changes the entire landscape because now the cartel leadership know their protection could be rendered moot. So you've got a two-pronged attack from Mr. Trump. One, they're threatening the Mexican government with leverage, utilizing trade tariffs. On the other hand, the foreign terrorist organization designation, that's not targeting the cartels. They're already all looking at life sentences. That's targeting the Mexican political figures. These are responsible, respectable people in their communities. High-level government officials, high-level military officials, high-level police officers, the law enforcement community. Well, if the American government charges those people, Mexico can't not turn them over. Like they have a lot to lose. Mencho's already looking at 4 life sentences. If you add a 5th life sentence to it, doesn't change his calculation. But the Mexican political class can't afford to be labeled as a terrorist, or the government can't be labeled as harboring terrorists. So on the public view, Trump is overtly threatening them. And keep in mind, for the first time just last month, Trump's administration publicly claimed that there's an intolerable alliance between the Mexican government and the cartels. That's 100% correct. This has been the case in the last 35 years of the modern cartel structure. But for the first time, it's been publicly stated. And so now the Mexican government is on its heels doing whatever they can to get out from underneath this tariff threat, including expelling people whom normally they would have never sent. You see the number of they've dismantled hundreds of small mom and pop labs in Sinaloa. Enormous seizures in country, not at the border, but in country.
Yep.
And so you see a concerted effort where they're trying to pad the numbers to make their pitch. And so Mr. Trump is essentially boxing the Mexican government into a position where they're going to go to the cartels and say, hey, stop the Feni, go back to where we were in 2015, and we can all keep making our money. Otherwise, the tariffs pose an existential threat to the Mexican economy. And so long as Mexico was treating the cartel issue as a law enforcement issue, the protection market could operate. Once you threaten their economy, the feeding off of the cartels becomes a secondary concern. At this point, they got to save the economy, which means Mr. Trump is maneuvering the Mexican government into essentially aligning the incentives from the cartels to us. And so it's a brilliant strategy, actually. I'm sorry.
No, I enjoy hearing your thoughts on that. Of those 29, is there any significant ones that you were surprised with?
Look, of course, the one that gets all the attention is Caro Quintero, simply because he was responsible for unaliving the DEA agent. And so obviously from a DEA perspective, from an American Department of Justice perspective, that's an enormous victory.
It's a big win.
That's a huge win. From an operational perspective, look, he had a very small organization. They were operating south of New Mexico, south of Arizona. Like operationally, look, 70-year-old men are coming in and taking over.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's an enormous victory for the purposes of the Camarena family, and I'm sure for the broader law enforcement community. Operationally, I don't really see it happening at much impact. The former leader of the Juarez Cartel, Vicente Carrillo. I mean, look, 20 years ago, the guy was a monster, huge. Again, significant in the sense that he's being held accountable for conduct that happened 20 years ago. The two guys from the Zetas, the one of the leadership structure of the Northeast Cartel, one of the groups that have been designated an organization by Mr. Trump. Trevinos were massive 15 years ago. And so it's essentially a list of individuals that were in Mexican prisons that the American government has been interested in getting their hands on. So the impact on the day-to-day operations is actually the fact that their protection broke down. And once the cartel leaders on the street realize that the protection market is not going to function, now they have to change their behavior because you got to get out from underneath this pressure. Well, the easy decision is get rid of the Feni. Yeah. See, the protection market came into existence in 2007 when Mexico declared war on the cartels, and the American Calderon came to the United States and said, hey, we need help. They said, fine, we'll help you, but you have to implement the same decapitation strike model that was being used in Iraq. Now they changed the name to kingpin strategy. And so in 2007, the kingpin strategy was implemented. Well, that prompted the cartels. See, it would have worked had the counterparty been Switzerland or Norway or a Western European country. In Mexico, it didn't work, however, because there are elements of the Mexican government that are corrupt. Well, they now were able to monetize their influence. So it created a protection market where the bribes became exorbitant. They're no longer are you paying $500,000 for a cop to look, for the police chief to look the other way. You're talking now $50 million bribes with Genaro Luna, $60 million with Cienfuegos, $30 million with Ramirez. And so literally there's $450 million worth of bribes for a dozen guys in that administration. So, although Sinaloa generates a lot of proceeds, let's say they make $4 billion in a year in profits, but that's $4 billion spread out over 60 organizations. That means this group makes 75 million, this group makes 200, this group makes 50. Nobody had the money independently to come up with 450 million. So they had to shift. They pivoted from trafficking primarily in cocaine to a more lucrative compound. That's where you got the explosion in crystal methamphetamine, because the crystal has a 900% return on investment, whereas the coke has a 200% return on investment. And we know that this happened because WikiLeaks disclosed the cables that were sent from the embassy in Mexico to the State Department in DC. Just 1 year after the implementation of the kingpin strategy, you had a 500% increase in crystal. Well, they had to take their capital and allocate it in a more lucrative venture. 7 years later, you had another pivot. This is where the new generation, after the 3 attempts on Menchel, they needed to raise more capital. They had to buy more protection. So they pivoted from the crystal to the Feni. Well, Feni is 2,400% return on investment. So you're a businessman, you've got so much capital that you could allocate. Maybe you want to build a new studio, maybe you want to get new cameras, maybe you want to get new software. You have to make a decision. How are you going to allocate your capital in the most rational manner? So just to keep it easier for your audience, if you've got $1 million, are you going to invest it in an operation that'll get you back 3? Or a second operation, which will get you back 9? Or a third operation, which will get you back 24 million? If you go with the third option, you're trafficking Feni. And so from the trafficking perspective, not the American side, but from the trafficking perspective in Mexico, allocating the capital into Feni is the most rational move. So when you're dealing with men who are making decisions based on money, you're not talking to terrorists. There's not a single cartel guy that's going to put a suicide vest on and blow himself up. They love the cars, they love the women, they love their lives, they love their houses. And so you can maneuver a man whose decisions are based on financial considerations. And that's what we see Mr. Trump actually trying to do. Anybody with an understanding of narcoeconomics and Mexican trafficking culture can clearly see what the strategy is.
Let me ask about, I have another guest who's coming on. He's
Okay.
I've had 2 CIA agents recently, former.
Oh, okay.
One of them talked about, she confirmed that there has been some covert operations in Mexico. And
Sure.
she didn't give me more than that, just says she can confirm.
Sure.
And then I have this other gentleman who I'm going to ask him some deeper questions with CIA's involvement. What are some thoughts on CIA's involvement with the cartels? And what is the question you want me to ask him?
What was the effort made right after 9/11 that the CIA, well, I don't know if they'll acknowledge it, but I spoke with numerous individuals after 9/11, and everyone said they shut down the border to make sure no Arabs got across.
Yes,
Like there was a dialogue there where they were.
Yeah, there was a dialogue. There was a dialogue, and I believe it was with Sinaloa Cartel.
Yeah.
And it was to ask them to it was some kind of partnership or some kind of agreement with the CIA and the cartel that's been confirmed.
Oh, it had been? Okay, yes. Interesting. Last week there was a big article in the New York Times where they broke the fact that the CIA has been having these drone flights over Mexico.
Yes. That's what my interview was essentially that's what we focused on with her.
What was interesting about that though is, I make it a point of corroborating the information that I learned, and I corroborated through open source material. And so there was a conversation I had a few years ago with one of the cartel guys, and he indicated that they had moved the Feni labs, the main ones, out of Sinaloa. So like they had one in Oaxaca, which is way south in Mexico, and then they had another one in Guatemala. And so when I read the New York Times article, and I pulled up other additional articles, one of them had like a map of where they're flying over. Like, you're not even flying over the right area. Like, you're in the wrong country. And so, but before I came forward on this, now I jumped on open source material and I started doing research, Feni, Sinaloa, Guatemala, and boom, up pops criminal prosecutions where the Guzman's organization's representative in New York was distributing 1,000 kilos of Feni, and he had 1,000 kilos for distribution, and that the Feni had originated in Guatemala. So this is, I think the value that I bring to the table is I have a deep understanding of the operations, and I'm able to independently take information from open source and put it together in a presentable, digestible manner for people to understand what's actually going on. Like the conversation about the Guatemala thing was just us talking on the yard while we're walking laps. It didn't become relevant until last week when I saw the article. I'm like, let me see if I can confirm that, because now it triggered the recollection of that discussion. And so, yeah, sure. Here, boom, the largest Sinaloa lab for Feni is in Guatemala. And so I'm sure, look, the Navy SEAL that I spoke with last week told me that the intelligence community doesn't have to rely on me to make statements on a podcast. Like, I have no doubt that they know. The FBI. So when they tell us that they're operating in Mexico, you can rest assured they're in Guatemala. They're in Honduras. Because this is information that's known to the FBI. It's known to the DEA because it's appearing in federal indictments. So unless there's just a massive breakdown in communication between our law enforcement agencies, I have no doubt that the depth of the CIA's involvement is at a much deeper level. Like the information that got disclosed in those leaks, our government has the names of every one of those officers. There's literally lists of officers that are dirty, identifying the amount of money they're getting paid and which organization and which cartel was paying. Well, that's the kind of leverage that we could use. We can let the Mexican authorities know, hey, look, we're prepared to indict these 700 officers. Get your people in line. because the goal ultimately is to stop the fentanyl.
Yeah.
And so long as that's the goal, you need leverage. Not leverage over the criminals. They're criminals. You need leverage over the individuals providing the protection that allows those structures to operate. You know, I previously sent you one of those schematics. You know, This is the Sinaloa Cartel. It's 44 organizations. This is as of last year. It's 44 organizations spanning 15 states. There are no comparable structures in the United States because law enforcement would break something up like that in a minute. They're only able to operate in Mexico because they got the tacit approval of elements of the Mexican government in certain circumstances, and in other circumstances, they got express approval.
If our country focused on the products that are coming from China, would that help?
There's very little product coming from China. You're talking about chemicals?
Yes. Sorry, the precursors.
Well, in 2019, China outlawed the production of fentanyl, and they restricted the precursors. Now, people are using the term precursor incorrectly. The precursor is the compound, the chemical that is precisely the predecessor group. So you take these three precursors, do a reaction, and you'll synthesize the fentanyl. That's not what the Chinese are selling. They're not selling precursors. They're selling the chemicals that are being used to make the precursors. Well, all of those chemicals, none of them are illegal. That's why the Chinese government is saying, what are you talking about? We can't ban stuff that's got normal commercial applications. If you've got a real chemist, or in the case of the guys in Mexico, you got 20-year-olds that are running labs. We had a chemistry professor from USC helping us. Well, that was an enormous barrier to entry. Well, today the kids just go on the dark web. They got what are essentially recipes. So you spend $3,000 in non-regulated chemicals, and you're producing $300,000 in product. So the economics has changed profoundly. And with respect to the Chinese, they're not sending precursors. There's company, first of all, Chapo Guzman's not picking up the phone and calling a guy in China saying, hey, send me some chemicals. It doesn't work that way. The 14K triad has 18 offices around the world. There's going to have half a dozen at least to a dozen shell companies. So the Chinese company, the company in South China, the chemical company that's producing the perfectly legal chemicals, they don't even know it's going to Mexico. You got a shell company out of Hong Kong purchasing the material to ship it to a shell company in Malaysia. The company in Malaysia sends it to Singapore. Singapore sends it to Indonesia. Indonesia sends it to Turkey. Turkey sends it to Spain, and it comes into Veracruz. The Chinese company has no idea where this is going. And you know that's the case because the United States has not charged any of the chemical companies. They're not doing anything illegal. They've charged the brokers, but the brokers aren't the chemical company. Like in my case, they didn't charge none of the companies. Everything was legal when we started the manufacturing runs. So whether it's the companies in Jersey, the companies in Germany, the companies in California, none of them got prosecuted. They had no idea that this chemistry professor, who had set up a small business, was taking these compounds, each of which were 100% legal, and conducting reactions that is going to be able to produce 3,4-methyl-dioxybenzomethylketone ketone, and then take these other chemicals that are used to make methylamine, and then do a reaction to reduce that to produce the ecstasy. Like you can't hold companies accountable for the conduct of individuals downstream when the individuals operating downstream are very sophisticated. And so by the time it gets to Mexico, you've got a lot of the chemicals are going to Peru. They're coming in through Spain into Veracruz. They're coming into Guatemala. They're coming into Honduras. It's not just a straight shot from China to Colima. And a lot of times what they'll do is when they get to Indonesia, they'll change the labels on them. So they're shipping palm oil. And so by the time it gets to customs in Mexico, even if the customs guy isn't dirty, and most of them, a lot of them are corrupt, but even if they're not corrupt, they're looking at a manifest showing palm oil originating out of Indonesia that was shipped from Singapore. They're not cracking open every 55-gallon drum on one of those enormous ships. You got 15,000 containers. They're not opening every container. They're not opening every 55-gallon drum inside of every container. So all you need to do is hide 10 containers, 10 55-gallon drums in a sea of thousands. And so the pressure has to be placed on the Mexican government to crack down on the Fenny production. Because if you're attacking the Chinese side, it's really a needle in a haystack circumstance.
Yeah. When you put it like that, now I understand, because I was very curious about like why aren't we doing anything about that? Well, when you put it that way, it makes more sense, and I appreciate that.
Sure.
Last thing, anything else you want to add? Anything you want to say to the show? It's your time, because I'm done with all my questions. I really had a good time.
No, look, as long as we understand that there's been an incentive misalignment for a very long time, and it's been exploited. And up until the Fenny crisis, people were just prepared to live with it. Every administration for the last 30 years has known that the Mexican government has been in bed. Elements of the Mexican government have been in bed with the cartels. And up until the time it's now, taking 100,000 Americans every year. Well, obviously, any administration would have to take steps to stop that. And I think that the current course of conduct is going to actually result in that much more modest goal. One of the big problems that we have is because the economics in Mexico have changed, that for the first time in the past 35 years of the modern cartel era, there are actually more organizations operating outside of the cartel structure than in the cartel structure. The incentives financially prior was based on the fact that you were able to purchase large amounts of product from the Colombians, and you're buying larger amounts, you're going to get a better price. The incentives weighed in favor of membership. Well, today, now that you're able to purchase the precursors, the 100% legal chemicals for just a few $1,000s to make $400,000 or $500,000, well, what do you need the cartel for? So the economics has resulted in there being over 500 drug organizations in Mexico. Sinaloa last year was the biggest cartel with 44. Between Sinaloa and Jalisco, you had 71 member organizations, but there's 500 of them. The two largest cartels capture maybe 12%. And so the issue is much more nuanced and much more complex, which is why you're really going to essentially need to coerce the Mexican government to pressure the large groups to say, hey, status quo ante. And then essentially you're going to have to deputize the cartels because they have to tell all the mom and pops, stop it.
Damn.
Because there are many more organizations outside the cartel structure than in the cartel structure. And so that poses problems because even if, let's say, Menchel were to send word, okay, we're going to stop. Well, he only has influence over the 29 organizations within his structure. He can't tell other groups what to do. And he can't tell the independent operators what to do. One of the problems that we have is our country wants to attack the large cartels, when in reality, you want one big one, not a bunch of small ones, because a bunch of small ones, you now enter into the picture, it's market forces, market dynamics. Once they all start competing with each other, each of them are now incentivized to sell as much product as possible because they have to raise capital. Capital, power in Mexico is defined by access to corrupt politicians. So you need money. So they have to flood the market. So if you've got 6 different organizations, they're all incentivized to raise capital, it's an enormous flooding of the market in the United States. Whereas if you have just one large cartel, they use monopoly power. And, monopolists throughout the history of our country, the monopolists artificially inflate the prices by restricting supply. They want fat profit margins per unit. Well, if you've got 6 cartels operating, they're not making fat profit margins per unit. They're making razor thin margins. They're just making up the difference in volume. Well, we want to disincentivize volume. So you want to say, hey, look, get one big group. They're going to do what they're going to do, as long as it's, not Feni, because they're, 20 years ago, Sinaloa was the largest cartel in the Western Hemisphere. Today, you've got 6 to 9 cartels, which are a fraction of their size at their peak, and you got much more product. Every time you take out a leader and the cartel structure disarticulates, it breaks down into fragments. Well, as you got fragmentation, each one of these groups start forming their own little baby cartels. The last thing you want are baby cartels running around. You want one big group, top down, chain of command, restrict the supply, make your fat profit margins per unit. So you will get less product in the United States. And quite frankly, it's someone that you can talk to on a back channel basis. Because if you keep attacking the groups and fragmenting them, you're going to get an enormous flow. This is just simple economics. But for whatever reason, our leaders don't want to accept what is elementary in every other context. And so I would suggest that, keep the structures small, single structures as opposed to multiple structures. Pick one. It doesn't matter which cartel you want. Pick one and say, you're the winners. And then eliminate the opposition group and just let them handle everything. Because the Mexican politicians are going to feed. They're going to want their money. There's too much money in Mexico being made. They're not going to stop. Well, at least this way you can control and structure it. Because right now, it's the Wild West. You've got 9 recognized cartels, 6 of which have been designated. And you've got at least 200 to 300 organizations operating outside of the cartel structure. So even if all 9 cartels say we're going to stop doing Feni, you got 300 other organizations that are just running wild.
Yeah. It's crazy.
We just have to be a little bit smarter in how we approach this issue.
Well, Pierre, again, I really appreciate your insight, your expertise, your thoughts. It's been another good hour of information. So thank you so much. I'm sure we'll circle back again.
No problem.
But we'll catch up soon, man. Thank you so much for your time, honestly.
Hey, no problem. Have a good day.
Thank you for listening to Borderland Narcosis, an Ironclad original. Don't forget to share with your friends and let them know what we got going on. Take care.